Well, I'm going to open this up with a discussion of Eudora Welty's Petrified Man. I want to set the stage for it, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm going back and forth with my online text using my other computer, so bear with me if there are some pauses, don't worry. I want to start off with asking you to just look at a few things. I'm not going to read it to you, but there are some passages in here that are really worth taking a close look at because, number one, look at the structure of the text, okay? It's a two-part structure. It's really, really simple, okay? Now, the voice you hear throughout, it'll fool you because she quotes other people. The voice you hear throughout is Leota's, and she's talking about Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Pike and all these other people. And even when she quotes other people, the dominant voice you hear is Leota's throughout. So we're given sort of the world from Leota's perspective. The second thing I want you to look at, and there are two parts are really important. There's this break in the text, and then we come back to it as well. And that's why I want you to look, secondly, at the setting of the piece, because it's very important. Now, let's do a little bit of, some of you all may not be from the South, and you may not have grown up, certainly when I grew up, but I'll tell you that years ago, people, especially women, would go and hang out where they would go hang out, and men would go hang out where they hung out, and there's quite a bit of sort of segregation by the sexes. If you look at old people today, they still do a lot of the things. If you go into like some breakfast restaurant or some cafe in the morning, you'll frequently see a whole bunch of old men together, all having coffee and solving the world's problems and shooting the bull and all this kind of stuff. And ladies will do the same thing, but I don't know whether that happens because you get older or because that generation used to be much more used to having sort of boys hang out with boys and girls hang out. I don't know. Anyway, I can tell you this, that when I was growing up, people didn't go to Tony and Guys or wherever you go get your hair done these days. I don't know. Especially in small towns in the South, ladies would go to beauty parlors, okay? And they didn't call them beauty shops. They didn't call them style salons. They called them beauty parlors. Parlor means to talk, okay? And a parlor in an old house is a sitting room or a living room or whatever. And that really kind of comes from the idea that back in the day, especially in small towns, and even today in really small rural areas, women would, for extra money, just basically open up a beauty salon or beauty parlor, as they used to call them, in their home. They'd convert a garage, or they'd put it right there in an unused living room or even bedroom. They'd just bring in, and the chairs and the dryers and everything else, and they would just open up their own business. Back then, you didn't need a license. I guess you could ruin anybody's hair without having any repercussions or anything. But they'd take like a little course or whatever, and then they would learn it from somebody else, and then they just opened up the shop and whatnot. My mother went to a lady named Myrtle. Myrtle would and her husband's name was Corky, and we used to have to hang out there. And as a kid, I'd play around on the floor and bring my little cars with me or whatever. My mother would get her hair done, and they'd take forever because you didn't just go there to get your hair done. You went there to get caught up on all the gossip and all the good stuff going on around town. Well, I want you to think about the setting. The setting is really interesting because it's confined to this one space for the most part, right? I mean, we hear about other things, but all of the action of the story actually is a conversation. Actually, it's two conversations in the same place, in the Robert E. Lee beauty shop, okay? I mean, who names her? Anyway, the Robert E. Lee beauty parlor or whatever. So this is very important that it's contained. Now, how are we hearing this? Nobody thinks about this, okay? It's primarily Leota, her voice, and she's narrating pretty much all of it. There's a little bit from other people, right? But it's primarily her voice. How are we hearing this? Well, I would submit to you that what Welty's trying to do without saying it is she's trying to put us in one of the beauty salon chairs. We're a customer, maybe, overhearing all of this, okay? We're not partaking in it, but we're hearing it all, okay? And it gives you this wonderful sort of slice of life opportunity to see this very typical sort of Southern bastion of their world, right? This is kind of a women's space, and to meet all these different sorts of people and everything. We get to overhear the conversations in this typical, it's not a small town, but it's kind of like a small Southern sort of neighborhood or whatever opportunity. Now, some three things that I want you to keep a look at while I go through some of the pieces here. Notice class. talking about social economic class. Notice that throughout here, because there's not a lot of big class distinction, but it does raise its head periodically, and at the very least, you're looking at sort of blue-collar, working-class, white Southerners and what they're like, okay? And we're going to talk about that more as we go on, but Welty is in part trying to sort of paint or sketch a picture on a canvas of who these people are and how they talk and what they're like. Just because Leota is the main character here and you hear from her the most, do not think that Welty thinks that she's the hero. She is not the hero. In fact, because Leota is talking, you actually have to pay a lot of attention and use your own brain and size her up, because she's not going to say negative things about herself. But if you read carefully, you can see that there's an awful lot not to like about Leota, okay? Even though she's kind of funny. She's fairly harmless, but she's kind of not the nicest person in some ways. But a lot of people will read the story and say, oh, Leota's the hero of the story and she's the best and she's telling us the truth. Wait a minute, is she really telling you the truth, or is she giving you this really slanted, biased, interpretation of things? I hope you can see through that. The second thing is this sort of sense of loss. Now, this is not the same kind of sense of loss of like having lost the Civil War, although the echoes in the background of it are there, right? These are displaced people. These are people looking for some sort of role, some sort of way to get ahead in modern society, and they just can't really seem to do it. And at the end, you see that Leota is pretty bitter and ticked off that she didn't get the dadgum reward and felt like she should have. So there's always this sense of loss, even if it's a trivial thing. And speaking of trivial, everyone will tell you this if you read Eudora Welty. She loves to depict people talking about stuff that to you and me is just silly, trivial stuff. But what she's trying to do is show you that there's a great deal of truth in the triviality that makes up our lives, okay? Now think about that for a moment. There's a great deal of truth in the triviality that makes up our lives. It tells you a lot about a person, what they chatter about, even if it's not seemingly terribly important. And then look at the crazy upside down outcome of the piece, okay? Is there any fairness to this? Is there any justice? Anything like that? These are important themes. It's dealt with in a humorous way, so you might be tempted to think, she's not really making any big important points. She's just having a couple of laughs. But I think she's trying to raise some interesting, deeper ideas here. At least that's what it seems to be. Now, Welty is not going to moralize. She just lets you see. She just lets you hear, and you have to connect the dots. You'll see that O'Connor is a lot more heavy-handed when we get to her two short stories. But Welty just wants to show you something, and you have to walk away, and you have to put it all together. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together and figure out for yourself how you feel about that, okay? So we're going to start off here just taking a quick look. I'm going to spend as little time as I can, but I want to get to some important passages. You have Leota and you have Mrs. Fletcher, okay, and they're talking and notice how Leota calls her Mrs. Fletcher. That is a really important thing. And Mrs. Pike, and she maintains that that term of that sort of more formal term to discuss them. Now, partly is because they're her customers, okay, but also because there seems to be sort of a difference there. Leota is Leota, Mrs. Fletcher is Mrs. Fletcher. Mrs. Fletcher dresses nicely, and there's a class difference there a little bit, okay? And there are times when Mrs. Fletcher, throughout the short story, sort of disapproves of the kind of conversations or the kinds of things. She really gets ticked off when she finds out that people know she's pregnant, because evidently people aren't supposed to know you're pregnant. I don't know why, but that particular sort of middle class or upper middle class, which for that day and age wasn't awfully classy, I'll tell you, they're very particular about that, because they want to make sure that people don't think of them as being anything other than a notch above, you see. So that's really important. Mrs. Fletcher's also a little bit torqued that Leota puts so much stock in this brand new friend of hers, Mrs. Pike, this lady from New Orleans. So the first half of the story is all about Mrs. Pike this and Mrs. Pike this, and she's my new best friend. And Fletcher seems to not like that very much, right? A little bit of jealousy, I don't know. Anyway, she tells him about the story of getting together, and she says, she must be cute, said Mrs. Fletcher. Honey, Cute ain't the word for what she is. I'm gonna tell you, Miss Pike is attractive. She has her a good time. She has a sharp eye out, that Miss Pike has. Well, indeed she does, because at the end of the story, if you've read all the way through, that sharp eye is going to cause a great division between the two of them. The way Leota talks about Mrs. Pike in the first half of the story, and the way she talks about her the second half of the story, which we guess is when we as her customer visit her again, you see, and we find out that she's not so keen on her because of that sharp eye. She dashed the comb through the hair and paused dramatically as a cloud of Mrs. Fletcher's hennaed hair floated out of the lavender teeth like a storm cloud, like a small storm cloud. Hair falling. Oh, Leota. Right? Uh-huh. Commencing to fall out, said Leota, combing again. Is it any dandruff in it? Nope, just falling out. Bet you it was that last permanent you give me that did it. Right? You had 14 minutes coming to you. Bound to be something. Dandruff. I couldn't have caught a thing like that from Mr. Fletcher, could I? Well, you know what I heard in here yesterday. One of them. Look at the terminology. Yesterday, right? Didn't she got the accent down? One of them Thelma's lady was setting over yonder in Thelma's booth getting a machineless. And I don't mean to insist or insinuate anything, Miss Fletcher, but Thelma's lady just happened to throw out, I've forgotten what she was talking about at the time, that you was P-R-E-G. And lots of times that'll make your hair do awful funny, fall out, and God knows what. It just ain't our fault. It's the way I look at it. There was a pause. The women stared at each other in the mirror. Who was it? Demanded Mrs. Fletcher. Honey, I really couldn't say. Not that you look it. Where's Thelma? I'll get it out of her. Now, honey, I wouldn't go and get mad over a little thing like that. And see, she's very sensitive about that. She doesn't want to look pregnant and all that kind of thing. So you get all of this sort of thing going on. Mrs. Hutchinson, we find out, is who it was, and she gets all mad and all that kind of thing. So anyway, she launches off into the story about Mrs. Pike and how they went out and how they have a good time and they run around. Now, you notice that they kind of go driving around and drinking, okay? They go down to the lake and they knock back a few. Not something that Mrs. Fletcher would do. Mrs. Fletcher is not only pregnant, but she wears stylishly pregnant things, okay? Pregnant lady things, maternity things, right? Stork allure dresses and whatever the stork allure. And so Mrs. Fletcher would never be caught dead running around in a 39 Dodge drinking beer with people that she doesn't even know from, for heaven's sakes, that sinful place, New Orleans. Jack's beer at that, not even good beer. And so she narrates this and goes around and they go to a circus sideshow, a traveling freak show. Now, if you didn't grow up when I grew up, boy, that was something. You would go to the county fair and you would see the traveling freak show. Now, they were all phony. It was like, the bearded lady, and it was clearly, obviously a fake, or maybe there was a lady with a real beard, or I don't know. But you'd go in there and you'd see like the strong man and all this kind of stuff, and they'd have freaks in there. Well, she begins to describe this to it. This is clearly really, really low-class entertainment, and Mrs. Fletcher is appalled that Leota would go do it, and she uses it as an opportunity to sort of slap Mrs. Pike around verbally in front of Leota, and says, she likes that kind of entertainment, does she? So she says, so Mrs. Pike, she give you a good look. She's very observant, a good judge of character, cute as a minute, She says, I bet you another Jack's that lady's 3 months on the way. What gall, Mrs. Pike, says Mrs. Fletcher. Miss Pike ain't gonna bite you. Miss Pike is a lovely girl, and you'd be crazy about her. Miss Pike, Miss Fletcher, but you can't sit still a minute. But she can't sit still a minute. She went to the traveling freak show. We went to the traveling freak show yesterday after work. I got through early, 9 o'clock, in the vacant store next door. What, you ain't been? No, I despise freaks, declared Mrs. Fletcher. Oh, well, honey, talk about being pregnant and all. You ought to see them twins in a bottle. You really owe it to yourself. What twins? Well, honey, they got these 2 twins in a bottle, see? Born joined plumb together. Dead, of course. Leota dropped her voice into a soft lyrical hum. They was about this long. Pardon, must have been full time, all right, wouldn't you say? And they had these 2 heads and these 2 faces and 4 arms and 4 legs, all kind of joined here. See, this face looked this way and the other face looked that way and over their shoulders, see, kind of pathetic. Glaw! Mrs. Fletcher said this. Well, ugly, honey, I mean to tell you, their parents was first cousins and all like that. Billy boy, give me a fresh towel from over Teeny's stack. This one's wringing wet, and I'm and quit tickling my ankles with that curler. I declare he ain't nothing. He don't miss nothing. Me and Miss Fletcher aren't one speck of kin, or me and Mr. Fletcher aren't one speck of kin, or he could never have had me. Oh, of course not, right? I mean, Mrs. Fletcher has to go out of the way to say, my husband and I aren't related. Well, who would assume that, right? So she's even defensive. Why? Because only low-class people are like, marry as cousins and things, hillbillies, hicks. So clearly there's a class thing going on here. Mrs. Fletcher's trying to maintain that sort of a... Then she goes on and says, well, honey, what Miss Pike liked was the pygmies. They got these pygmies down there, too, and Miss Pike was just wild about them. The teensiest men in the universe. Well, honey, they can just rest back on their little bohunkus and roll around, and you can't hardly tell if they're sitting or standing. That'll give you some idea. They're about 42 years old. Just suppose it was your husband, right? Well, Mr. Fletcher is 5'9" and 1/2. Fred's 5'10", but I tell him he's still a shrimp on account of I'm so tall. Well, these pygmies are all kind of dark brown, Miss Fletcher. Not bad looking for what they are, I don't care for them. What does that Mrs. Pike see in them? Oh, I don't know. She just cute, that's all. But they got this man, this petrified man, that ever since he was 9 years old, when it goes through his digestion, somehow Mrs. Pike says it goes to his joints and has been turning him to stone. How awful. He's 42 too. Looks like that's a bad age. Just the weirdness of this, right? In a way, it's funnier if you can kind of visualize who these people are engaged in this conversation. If I were a woman in that beauty parlor, listen to this conversation, I would just be biting a hole through my lip because this is so funny. These people, the way they act, the way they talk, what they're talking about. Who said so? Mrs. Pike? I bet she's 42. No, Miss Pike's 33, born in January, an Aquarian. She's not an Aquarius, she's an Aquarian, right? Somebody who lives in an aquarium, I don't know what. He could move his head like this. Of course, his head and mind ain't a joint, so to speak, and I guess his stomach ain't either. Not yet, anyways. But see, his food, he eats it and it goes down, and then he digests it, and it goes out into his joints. Before you can say, Jack Robinson, it's a stone, pure stone. He's just turned to stone. How'd you like to be married to a guy like that? All he can do, he can move his head just a quarter of an inch, and he looks just terrible. I should think he would. Mr. Fletcher takes bending exercises every night of the world. I make him. All Fred does is lay around the house like a rug. I wouldn't be surprised if he woke up one day and couldn't move. Petrified man just sat there moving his quarter of an inch, though, Leota said reminiscently. Did Mrs. Pike like the petrified man? Not as much as she liked the others. Is Mr. Pike a good dresser? Oh, well, yeah, he's about 12, 14 years older than her. He asked Lady Evangeline about him. Who's Lady Evangeline? Well, it's this mind reader they had at the freak show. Was real good. Lady Evangeline's her name, and if she had another dollar, if I had another dollar, I wouldn't do a thing but have my other palm read, and so on and so forth. She goes on about the freak show, and you're wondering, where is this going? Why is she doing this? But she's setting you up a little bit, right? Because we find out that later on, of course, Mrs. Pike sees a magazine in Leota's property, in her home, in her spare room or whatever it is, and recognizes a wanted picture in the magazine, the True Detective magazine, and it's the petrified man, because he's a rapist and all, okay? And so the story kind of wraps up with the second visit, I guess, that we all make to the barbershop, the beauty salon, and at that point, things have changed. The worm has turned, as they speak. Leota no longer thinks so good. Oh, Mrs. Pike, Leota combed Mrs. Fletcher's hair with heavy strokes. You act like you're tired. Tired? Feel like it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon already. I ain't told you the awful luck we had, me and Fred. It's the worst thing you ever heard of. Maybe you think Mrs. Pike's got sharp eyes. Shoot, there's a limit. Well, we rented out our room to Mr. and Mrs. Pike from New Orleans when Sal and Joe Fentress came out. So they find the magazine, Startling G-Man Tales, and she collects the reward and all. And she's all ticked off about it. Well, at first Mr. Pike didn't want to do anything about it. Can you feature that? Said he kind of liked the old bird and said he was real nice to him, lent him money or something. But Mrs. Pike simply told him that they could go to hell, that he could just go to hell, and can see her point. And she says, you ain't worked a lick in 6 months, and here I have $500 in 2 seconds, and what thanks do I get for it? You can go to hell, Canfield. So Mrs. Pike basically gives Mr. Pike the boot. We find out that the petrified man's name is Mr. Petrie, and so anyway, it's this is kind of a slice of life thing. You almost feel guilty laughing at these people because you're going, really, I'm laughing because they're kind of low class and hicks, which makes me feel a little bit squeamish because I don't mean to feel like superior and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, Billy Boy is running around the barbershop, and he's kind of this sort of background character until she grabs hold of him and everything. Leota screams, "Billy Boy, what are you doing in my purse?" "Oh, I'm just eating these old stale peanuts." "You come here to me," right? "This is the last straw." I caught him, giggled Mrs. Fletcher. I'll hold him in my lap. "You bad boy, you. I guess I better learn how to spank little old bad boys." Leota's 11 o'clock customer pushed the swinging door up upon Leota, paddling him heartily with the brush, while he gave an angry but belittling screams while penetrated beyond the booth and filled the whole curious beauty salon from everywhere. Ladies began to gather around and watch the paddling. Billy, but you can't tell whether it's really a serious paddling or she's got a little put out with him because she's kind of mad after telling the story about she got screwed over for $500. Takes it out a little bit on Billy, but I don't think she's really beating the heck out of him. Billy Boy kicked both Leota and Mrs. Fletcher as hard as he could. The little brat. Mrs. Fletcher with her new fixed smile. "There, my little man," gasped Leota. "You won't be able to set down for a week if I knew what I was doing." Billy Boy stomped through the group of wild-haired ladies and went out the door, but flung back the words, "If you're so smart, why ain't you rich?" Which is a pretty darn profound philosophical statement. If you're so smart, Leota, how come you ain't rich? Because you sure missed out on the $500. I can't tell you that there's some big, gigantic moral something or other going on here, but there's some interesting stuff, and she just wants to show you just a glimpse into her world and the people that populate it. And it's fascinating, and it's funny, and it's interesting, and they're all filled with terrible flaws. Not one of these people is an angel. All of them are a little bit on the selfish side, very vain, very flawed, but funny, and just it's just kind of showing you, aren't we all funny? Aren't we all? It doesn't matter if it's just some white ladies in Jackson, Mississippi in a beauty parlor. We're all funny and we're all full of ourselves. But a fascinating piece. We'll look at the next one we'll look at is another piece that's kind of a soliloquy of sorts, okay, called "Why I Live at the P.O."